So now we are in the vision of the self. And last week we saw a very interesting thing, that what is the vision of God? If we were to ask, what is the vision of God? The vision of God is equivalent to the vision of the self, because God, without upadis, without conditionings, and jiva, without conditionings, are essentially one. Just like the wave is water, the ocean is water. So the darshan of God is actually the darshan of oneself. And this darshan, although we say it's seeing, it's a vision, we can't really see the self, because the self is the ultimate seer and it can never be seen. So when we talk about vision of God, which is the vision of oneself, what that really means is Atma Samstitihi, is abidance in the self. That's what it means. It's not that we're seeing the self. It's not that we're trying to look for the self. It's not objectifying the self, but it's abiding in the self. Why? Because the self is Atmanirdvayat. The self is non-dual. So there is only that self, and that is abidance. Now, after this part, one might ask the question, then what about knowledge? We talk about knowledge of the self. So what role does knowledge play? If you're saying the self is non-dual and we can't really have the vision of the self, so what role does knowledge play? So let us see now verse 27. I will chant and you can repeat after me. It's a very beautiful verse. Jnana varjita jnana hina chitta jnanamasti kim jnatumantaram Jnanavarjita jnanahina chitta jnanamasti kim jnatumantaram. So what it says here is, what is really knowledge, right? Or what is that consciousness? Consciousness is that which is jnana varjita. It's devoid of the thought of knowledge, ajnana hina chit, and it's devoid of the thought of ignorance. Jnana varjita. Varjita means devoid or without. Jnana, the thought of knowledge. Ajnana. The next word is ajnana. Hina. Hina means devoid of ignorance. So that which is devoid of knowledge, that which is devoid of ignorance. So in your book, if you look at the Sanskrit trend, if you look at Sanskrit, there is an avagraha. So that means ajnana hina chit. If you look at the English, there's an apostrophe there. So you take that as varjita ajnana hina chit. Okay, so just make that note. Then jnanamasti kim. So jnatumantaram, he says jnatum antaram. Other than the knowledge of which is the self, other than knowledge which is the self, jnanamasti, is there another knowledge? So I'll read this and then we will go forward. Consciousness is devoid of the thought of knowledge and the thought of ignorance. Is there a knowledge other than consciousness to know the self? There is none. So what is essentially happening here is this. Why do we need self-knowledge? Self-knowledge plays a very important role, which it removes ignorance. And that's why it's called jnana. Ignorance is called ajnana. Jnana is opposed to ajnana. What do you mean it removes ignorance? As though Brahman is veiled, as though it can't be veiled, but as though Brahman is veiled. And so therefore, because we think that Brahman is veiled, therefore that knowledge of Brahman has to occur, because we are ignorant of it. We are ignorant of it. Therefore, that knowledge of Brahman has to occur. But this knowledge of Brahman is what? It's also a thought. It's also a thought. And that thought just removes that ignorance, and that is it. And Brahman reveals itself. So Brahman is not really known by knowledge. So this is a very important point. Brahman is not known by knowledge. It is not revealed by knowledge. Knowledge has a very, very unique purpose, and the purpose of knowledge is just to remove that ignorance. Because that knowledge cannot reveal Brahman, because Brahman reveals knowledge. You understand? Brahman is the one that illumines knowledge. Now, so first we understood that the purpose of knowledge is to remove ignorance. Now, in this world, you see this very funny thing. We call it as knowledge, we call it as ignorance, but what is it really? It's a thought. Ignorance is a thought. Knowledge is a thought. And both thoughts are revealed by Brahman in that both require the reflection of consciousness. When we say vritti or thought, what it means is the reflection of consciousness is in the mind. It manifests in the mind, and the mind takes a form of the object. Because the mind on its own cannot know anything. So you need the reflection of consciousness to actually know something. So therefore, that self illumines both the thought of knowledge and the thought of ignorance. And then when you look at it also, knowledge can become ignorance, ignorance can become knowledge. Now, knowledge, let's say now we know Upadesha Sara, we've been listening to all of the verses, we've been chanting it. But after 2 months, this knowledge can also become ignorance, right? And ignorance is something, before, when we were very young, we didn't know how to use the iPad or computer or phone or anything. We didn't know. But now we know. So ignorance itself can become knowledge. Knowledge itself can become ignorance. So this knowledge, this ignorance, these are just thoughts. They're just thought modifications. So this Brahman is even the one that is beyond knowledge and beyond ignorance. It's not knowledge, it's beyond knowledge. So therefore, that knowledge cannot reveal it, because it by its own light, knowledge happens. By its own light, ignorance happens. So when we look at the verse, this is exactly what it means. What is this knowledge? Knowledge, what is this consciousness? Jnana varjita, that consciousness which is devoid of knowledge. Ajnana hina chik, consciousness which is devoid of ignorance. Nyatumantaram, other than this, could there be any knowledge? So now that we know consciousness is that which illumines knowledge, which illumines ignorance, why then do we want to know this consciousness? Why then do we want to realize this consciousness, I should say? In verse 28, it's going to tell us. Kim swarupame tyatma darshane avyaya bhava purnachit sukham. Kim swarupame tyatma darshane avyaya bhava purnachit sukham. So why do we want to know this or realize this? Because it says here that chit is sukham. That consciousness itself is sukham. He says, Kim swarupam iti atma darshane. Atma darshane, upon realization, Kim swarupam iti, I ask, what is my nature? Avyaya, it's undecaying. Abhava, unborn. Apurna, complete. Chit, consciousness, and sukham, bliss. So why would we want to realize this? Why are we going so deep into it? Is because it is bliss. So let us analyze this for a moment. Last time we had, we had explored how also Sat is Ananda, Chit is Ananda. Last week we explored that. So now here we will look at it from a different way. See, what everyone is searching for is joy, worldly joy. But then actually, the very fact that we cannot do without it tells us that it's our nature. Guruji brings two very beautiful points in this commentary. He says the nature of a thing is defined as that which it cannot give up. Every day we are wanting joy. We're searching for joy. We're seeking for joy in and throughout so many ways, whether it's a person, a place, a thing. All we want is some semblance of joy. We just want to be happy, even for a moment. We just want to smile. And because we cannot give that up, it actually shows that it's our nature. Our nature is joy because we cannot give it up. For one moment, we cannot be without it. In fact, it's the sole purpose for all of our actions. Nobody does anything for sorrow, right? Nobody goes anywhere for sorrow, talks to anybody because they want to be sad. And we're all pursuing this joy. The second is, he says that one's nature is never a burden to oneself. So that joy, I never feel burdened by it. When I'm happy, I never feel like I want to get rid of it. In fact, I want it to stay forever. But sorrow, on the other hand, is like a burden when somebody is sick, diseased, worried, stressed, tensed. All of that, it's like a burden. It's like a heavy thing on our shoulders. That's something we just want to get rid of. So what he's saying here is, first of all, because this thing, you cannot give it up. No matter what happens, you cannot give it up. That means it's your nature. And because this thing is never a burden to you, joy, happiness is never a burden to you, that means it's your nature. And what kind of joy is this? Avyaya. Avyaya means it doesn't end. Whenever happiness ends, it's sorrow only, isn't it? Whenever we experience a happy moment and then we know it's going to end, that is equal to sorrow. Memorial Day weekend, everyone's so happy, but it's going to end on Monday. That's happiness is sorrow only, right? There's vyaya, it's going to end. Then abhava, when something is born or produced, that happiness is sorrow only. Why? Because now it's going to come. When is it going to go? It came, it's so beautiful, it came to me, an experience, a person, it came to me, it's so wonderful. But I'm always tensed. When is it going to go? Is it going to go? What if it goes? What will happen? I'm always tensed because that kind of happiness was produced. So when that kind of happiness is produced, I can't be in peace. That happiness is only sorrow. You can't even call it happiness. So, but this happiness of the self is abhava. It's not produced. It's not born. So there's never a fear of it going away or losing it or what will happen. There's never that kind of fear. You understand? With this worldly happiness, how much it takes us up and down. It's crazy. And then this worldly happiness is incomplete. Huh? That it is sometimes we only find happiness in one particular object, in one particular place, in one particular time. After that, we're sad again. So for example, summertime, people are happy because outdoors we can finally go. But then after that, it's not there anymore. I will be sad. I'm only happy in summer. I'm only happy if I'm in New York City. I'm only happy if I'm with this person. We condition these things, and we know this. We condition our happiness. And when we condition our happiness, we actually set ourselves up for sorrow. That is sorrow, oh sorrow. Because that is saying only in this limited place, in this limited time, with this limited person, I will be happy. That means we will be very sad. That's all that it means. But this joy or happiness of the self is apurna, it's infinite. It doesn't matter what time, it doesn't matter what place, it doesn't matter what person or object, because it's beyond that. This is the nature of the self. So it's a very different kind of bliss. That's why people keep seeking it, keep wanting it, keep searching for it. Now, how is this bliss consciousness? How is this consciousness bliss? Whenever we talk about limited happiness, like what we talked about, limited because it's going to end, limited because it's produced, limited because it depends on an object or a person or an experience. Now, where do all these limitations exist? This limited happiness exists in the mind. Whenever the mind is there, then only we have this thought of happiness, isn't it? And we have these limitations of space, of time, of objects. But when the mind is not there, then there's unlimited sukham. Or when we transcend the mind, there's unlimited sukham. It's a thoughtless joy. So therefore, now we know that this chit, this consciousness, we know this consciousness is beyond the mind. How do we know it's beyond the mind? Because in the verse before this, it said that it's beyond the thought of ignorance, beyond the thought of knowledge. So it's not the thought of ignorance, it's not the thought of knowledge, it's beyond that. So we understand this consciousness is beyond the mind. And we also understand that true joy is beyond the mind. It cannot exist in the mind. In fact, true joy is freedom from the mind. And therefore, that chit is that sukha. You get it? Little bit thinking we have to do, but this is one. Last week I gave you another way to look at it. This week, this is another way to look at it. So that, again, how we know that consciousness is beyond the mind. We know because it's beyond thought of knowledge, thought of ignorance. So we know consciousness is something beyond the mind. Then we also know that the true joy of the self is also beyond the mind. Why? Because it says here that joy of the self is limitless. There's no end, there's no beginning, it's not limited to a particular object, place, or time. And limitations only exist in the mind. Therefore, this joy of the self is beyond the mind. Therefore, that chit is also that sukha. That consciousness is also that joy of the self. And not only that, but that is my nature. And we have also seen how existence is beyond the mind, right? Because in deep sleep, when the mind is dormant, we are there. We are there. So that existence is also beyond the mind. So in this way, he says, this is why people strive for the realization of the self. This is why people want to know the self. And then one more thing deeper, he says, but now who is this quest for? Who is this entire quest? You know, Bhagavan Ramana Maharishi ji, you were telling me about this whole thing that, look, first one has to realize the self. One has to gain this vision of the self. And then you're saying the vision of the self is really abidance in the self. And you're saying, okay, but how does one get this abidance of the self? That knowledge. But what is the role of that knowledge? The role of knowledge is just to remove ignorance. That's it. It cannot illumine the self. It just has to remove ignorance. Because the self is beyond knowledge and beyond ignorance. Now, why do I want to know the self? Because I want to be happy, or I want to understand my nature as pure awareness, pure consciousness, pure bliss. Now, all this drama and all these things that you're telling me, who is this for? So very beautifully, he says, all this is only for the Jiva, because Atma ever is. It ever is consciousness. It ever is bliss. It ever is existence. All of this running around, seeking the self, finding the self, searching the self, it's only for the Jiva. We'll just touch upon this verse today. Bandhamuktyati tam param sukham vindati haji vastu daivikaha. Bandhamuktyati tam param sukham vindati haji vastu daivikaha. So we will just touch upon this lightly. What he's saying here is, in this world, there is two. Two here means there is a rare one. Rare who daivika. There's a rare daivika, divine jiva. There's a rare divine individual. And what does that individual do? Vindati. That individual gains param sukham, supreme happiness. There's not worldly joy, this is supreme happiness. And what is this supreme happiness? It's bandha mukta atita. It's beyond bondage, beyond liberation, iha, here itself. So here in this world, some rare individual with divine qualities gains supreme happiness, which is beyond bondage and liberation. So this whole thing of wanting to search or seek the self, wanting to realize the self, this is only for who? The jiva. Because the self is beyond bondage, beyond liberation. There's no bondage that exists in Brahman. There's no liberation that exists in Brahman. Brahman is ever free. So there's no process of being liberated. And just as we saw, I will just leave this example for you to think about, and then we will go deeper next time. Yesterday at Vivekachudamani, there was an example of the rope and the snake, right? What is bondage? Bondage is, on the rope, I see a snake. I imagine that there's a snake and I'm so afraid. I want to run away. I'm just panting. I'm just going nuts. What is liberation? I turn on the light and I realize, oops, there's no snake. So bondage and liberation is essentially the appearance and disappearance of the snake. But then what happens to the rope? Nothing. The rope is ever free. The rope was never bound. So what that really means is you're already free, pretty much. But because we think there's a snake there, we have to gain knowledge that there's no snake there so that we can realize our freedom. But actually, here and now, iha, he says here, and even right now, we are already free. This whole quest is only for the jiva. This whole quest is only for the jiva who thinks that he or she is a jiva. And which jiva is going to be able to realize this self, to realize that, oh my gosh, there was never any bondage to begin with, and that I am actually ever free. Which jiva is going to realize this? Daivikaha, that divine jiva. And that word Daivikaha indicates all the qualities that we have studied before in Tattva Bodha. That it's in your book, but if you remember, you're going to tell me ignorance is just a thought. So it's okay. It's okay if we don't remember, right? So now what more into this we will see next week.